Hello and welcome to the Majlis Podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. War broke out between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan last week, and this latest fighting was worse than what we saw in late April 2021. At least 100 people were killed in clashes between September 14th and 17th. There have been problems between communities along the common border for some time, but starting in early 2014, military forces from both countries became increasingly involved in disputes that previously were fistfights and rock throwing that resulted in several people receiving medical attention for bruises, and that turned into casualties from gunshot and artillery wounds and widespread destruction of buildings and other property. While the governments of the two countries trade accusations over who started the shooting, and border guards of the two countries continue to regularly exchange fire, stuck in the middle are people of the area, Kyrgyz and Tajik villagers who are just trying to make a living. How has life changed for the people living along the Tajik-Kyrgyz border? To discuss all this, I'm joined by Madeline Reeves, a professor of social anthropology at Oxford University and author of the book Border Work, Spatial Lives of the State in Rural Central Asia, which is based upon observations she made when she lived in the area along the Kyrgyz-Tajik border where so much of the fighting has taken place. Madeline, thank you very much for joining me. I know this is an area that's near and dear to both of us. First was down there in 1992. When the biggest concern at the time was what are we going to do with being people of independent countries? No one really understood what independence really meant, and of course there were concerns because the Tajik civil war had just started, and those were really the main concerns of life. But you actually stayed and lived with these people for a long time, and I remember at a conference at Cambridge some years back, you gave for example, a speech, and you were talking about the bus routes. Now, this is an area that was, the border was drawn during Soviet times. It weaves in and out. If you're on the lone road that existed, you would pass in and out of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan several times as you made your way along this road. And there are parts where the road is actually the border, where one side of the road is Tajikistan and the other side of the border is Kyrgyzstan. But you made the point that prior to the hostilities breaking out some 10 years ago, the communities were connected by a number of things, and you used the bus as one example of how people had to get along, or at least they interacted with each other because they had to ride the bus together to get to places. Can you give us a picture of what life was like along the border when you were living there?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Bruce, for the invitation and the introduction. So I first went to the area that we might refer to as the Farah Valley. That is to say the kind of group of Kyrgyzstani and Tajikistani villages that lie along the Farah River, and that connects sort of Varokh at one end and the town of Farah at the other end. I first went there in 2004. At the time, I was working at Batken University and conducting fieldwork for my PhD, and I used to go there quite often to do interviews, to do fieldwork in villages sort of, on either side of the border there. And I remember the first time taking this bus, which I took many times, that started in Batken and that ended in the village of Aksai. And at that time, it was the same bus, I think, that had been in use since the 1970s. It was one of these old yellow buses they called Bulutchki. That bus route, it was, I think, very indicative of the way that social relations kind of were organized in this region at that time, in that, like you say, it sort of tacked in and out of the Kyrgyzstan border, the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border multiple times, right? Between starting in Batken and ending in Aksai. It went through Charkuh, it went through Sur, it went through Samarkandik in Kyrgyzstan. So it went through all these places that now are quite kind of, they're quite sort of, let's say, social life is quite separate, quite disconnected from one another on either side of those borders. And like you say, I think the bus, it forced at a very basic level a certain form of very, very basic social interaction, right? Standing at a bus stop, but also I remember very clearly the social sort of interaction that was on the bus. And so it was Kyrgyz and Tajiks both taking this bus because it stopped on both sides of the border through all these little villages. And it took about 2.5, 3 hours to go from Batkent to Aksai, right? There was always this kind of very, elaborate, we might say, sort of performance of cordiality at a very, very basic level, right? In terms of exchanging greetings, in terms of offering up one seat to somebody who was older than you, in terms of, helping somebody to move their bags because everyone was coming on with shopping or whatever. Then when they were coming from market town and going back to their villages, helping people with little kids, it was a sort of little microcosm of, in a way, just the simple basic need to get along in a confined space, right? And, there were sort of ways in which that was marked through language. Very often people would communicate with one another in Uzbek, that being the sort of de facto common language between Kyrgyz speakers and Tajik speakers here. And certainly between, say, older men who greeted each other, there was this kind of very, elaborate way of greeting one another, of asking whether one was healthy, and so on and so forth. And I think the reason that I gave that example, and that paper already, I think, is from more than 10 years ago, is that I think public transport is one of those spaces that we tend not to pay much attention to, right? It's sort of banal, it's taken for granted and so forth until it doesn't exist, until it fails. And one of the consequences of the fact that this region has not just been more sort of securitized, right? So that crossing borders now, you can only cross at certain sort of formal crossing points and you need documents and so on and so forth. But the fact that a lot of the infrastructure that has been built over the last decade has been built in a sense to allow ways of bypassing the neighboring state, has had the sort of de facto effect of minimizing those habitual spaces of social contact. I'll just give one other small example because it ties in with this. But there was this expression that one would often hear, which was, this is a place where, there are all of these kind of reasons for tension, right? I don't want to romanticize that this is somehow a place where, that there hasn't historically been a lot of tension, a lot of grievance and also in Soviet times, some significant outbursts of conflict. But there was this kind of dominant discourse that, we all use the same bazaar, right? That was the expression, bazar was bir. And that was true in a very material sense, that people would use the same markets. They would go to Charku for certain things. They would go to Varokh for certain things. They would go to Samarkand for certain things. They might go to Isfara for certain larger purchases. But basically, there was a recognition that markets were a certain kind of shared space, and that, you might not feel huge sort of warmth, or you might not know the people living in the other village particularly closely, but you would at least trade, right? That there was this space of social interaction. And again, that has been sort of dramatically, those spaces of social interaction have been really, really reduced in the last few years. And I think, I don't want to link. In fact, I'm very kind of wary of suggesting any kind of immediate direct causal link between those transformations and what's been happening in the last couple of days, right? Which I think is much more bound up with sort of domestic politics and domestic political crisis in Tajikistan and militarization and so forth. But I think if we're talking about shifting relations at a daily level, the changing kind of nature of those spaces, I think, is really important. And the fact that kind of life is just sort of lived on increasingly mono-ethnic and nationally defined lines.
Well, no, great. Thank you. You have an interesting comment there about the use of Uzbek, because, in 1999, when I was down in Batken, and I wanted to see how people were living along the border, because the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan was up in the mountains, and everyone knew that. So it was, for the first time, Batken was getting a lot of attention from the Kyrgyz government, certainly, and even the Tajik government was paying a little more attention to what was happening way up there north in Varokh and those places. But I wanted to see how the presence of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan had affected people living in this area, right along the border. And I was able to drive all the way to Varokh, and I walked up to the entrance to the place and started talking to some of the Tajiks about it. And the Kyrgyz in those days, they still got along very well. And the Kyrgyz saw me, somebody like me talking to the Tajiks. And so people that were in the area just kind of came and sat there and talked to me too. And I asked them a bunch of questions about how has this changed your life? Do you feel threatened? Things like that. And it was very curious to me that both the Tajiks and Kyrgyz said, well, those are Uzbeks, right? They kind of this distinction that we're Kyrgyz and Tajiks, and the militants are Uzbeks, so they're different than us.
Yeah.
So and there was this understanding between them that they were somehow tacitly allied in this defense, or at least certainly in the posturing against the militants, because they weren't Uzbeks, they were Kyrgyz and Tajiks who had lived in this area. I want to get a little more about the lifestyle of people. When I think of that area and the times I went through, certainly in the first 20 years that I was going through there, the thing that I always remember is apricots, right? Which is kind of strange, but that's all. They had great apricots there too. So I want to get a sense of what people did to make a living. I remember this area as having a lot of sheep, as I said, a lot of apricots. It's a farming community, an agriculturally based community for the most part, right? And not the connections to the outside world have grown in recent years, but really, 20 years, even 15 years ago, they weren't very well connected even to their own countries, really. Is that your observation?
Yeah. So, there's several things in there. First, in terms of like the kind of, the physical geographical connections. I remember, again, when I first went to Batken, there wasn't even a direct kind of road connection to get to Bishkek at that stage, right? And historically, again, in Soviet times, if you wanted to get from Batken to Frunze, as was, you would have gone through the Farah Valley, you'd have gone through Uzbekistan and then through Kazakhstan and kind of entered in that way. So, so I think that's certainly an important point. And to a certain extent, I think that sense, that perception in Bishkek that Batken is somehow, far away and remote and so on, really, I think still persists, even though, those connections have changed. And until I think the flights from Batken to Bishkek, for instance, resumed, I would say like 2003, 2004. There was a period after the Soviet Union collapsed when there weren't any flights from Batken town, right? So certainly in terms of those connections. And then your other point about the kind of, the sense here that, we're Kyrgyz and Tajiks and we don't have any, we get along just fine, not like those Uzbeks. I think that one of the things in the Farah Valley, right, is that I think you can find those forms of discourse about sort of similarities and alliances and kind of connections, just as you can also find discourses that talk about huge differences, right? And the question is which of those kinds of discourses is dominant or which is invoked in a particular situation. So certainly I also heard, a lot of discourse about, having, similar mode of life, but also just having had to kind of, because of being neighbors and sharing this infrastructure, of having to get along, and indeed of sort of social life not being particularly nationalistic, let's say, and people quite happily sort of switching language or that sort of thing. And I think then you also mentioned about the kind of economic resources, economic basis of life. I think that the shift in sort of economic mode of life, or let's say the shifts that have come about as a result of the fact that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan took very different economic courses in the post-Soviet period are quite significant too. So certainly, even back as far as 2004, I remember in the Kyrgyz villages, there was this kind of sense that, those Tajiks, they live a lot better than us. Baylar kup was the way it was often put. There are lots of rich people. And, this was often read in terms of people pointing out, 2-story houses and so on and so forth. Now, the picture, I think, is also more complicated than that, because what you have on the Tajik side of the border, certainly in somewhere like Charku or Sur, is incredible population density. Really quite, for Central Asia, quite extreme population density. Certainly for a rural community, and that is there are historical reasons for that to do with kind of demographics, but it's also to do with the geographical location of Charku and the lack of spare land available. And so I think this has also, one of the consequences of that is that I think led people to rely on migration specifically to Russia as a sort of mode of sustaining livelihoods in Tajikistan really comparatively early, right from the 1990s. In Kyrgyzstan, the kind of turn towards Russia as a mode of life, as a sort of a mode of, source of income and so forth, it took off in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, but it started slightly later. But that, again, I think has significant consequences. I did some research on this in 2005 and 2010 in quite a sort of systematic way, interviewing like several hundred people about their migration destinations and so forth. And it was really striking that the destinations on the two sides of the border were completely different. There were these completely different networks in operation in terms of where people were migrating to. But I think one of the sort of impacts of that is that it has introduced new levels of economic stratification in villages, right? There's just a lot more wealth inequality, but it has also meant that those kind of, again, those sort of links that might habitually have existed between young men in particular, Kyrgyz and Tajik young men, are attenuated by the fact that sort of Russia is now the main point of orientation for young male school leavers. There's a sort of expectation that, you go and work in Russia for several years and often for many, many years. And I think that has also, in terms of kind of mode of life, had a significant impact. And then perhaps it's worth mentioning, the alleged role of the narcotics trade in contributing to a certain sort of, well, again, to economic stratification, but also potentially to a certain kind of lawlessness. That was, and I say this with a certain degree of like couching this and hesitancy, because this was something that I never, tried to investigate in any empirical way. I'm going here on the sort of, the rumors and the discourse, which was, there are a lot of rich people there in Tajikistan across the border because there are all of these families who are involved in the narcotics trade. Right? I'm not claiming that assertion is true, but even the fact that narrative existed was itself, I think, socially significant.
No, this is an interesting point you raised too, because the rumors are what at least what people believe about this region is interesting to me too. The narcotics trade, for instance, to go back to 1999, when I first approached people again in this very area, Aksai, Varuk, those places, and said, what do you know about Juma Namangani? Everyone identified him as the major narcotics trafficker between Afghanistan and southern Kyrgyzstan, not as the head of a militant group, but as the major narcotics trafficker, right? So this is how they knew who he was, or at least what they believed who he was. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about this migration thing, because I think, this is one of the more interesting aspects that gets overlooked about what causes the conflict in this area. When I was there in 2015, I was in Aksai, and I asked some Kyrgyz guy what the problems were, and he was it was just me and him, so no one else could hear what he was saying. And he told me that the problem was that a lot of Kyrgyz from the area were leaving the area as labor migrants and selling their property to people in Tajikistan. And this was causing a lot of conflict. There was clearly no formal contract for this kind of thing, right? It was a simple cash deal. The new Tajik owners of this land, of course, were sectioning off what they had just bought. And that it caused a lot of problems among the Kyrgyz population. And later, it was in fact, I have it right here on my screen. In January 2020, there was a Kyrgyz deputy prime minister, Janish Razakov, said that Kyrgyz who sell their homes or land along the border to Tajik citizens are traitors. So clearly this was going on. I mean, would you say that that's these kind of informal land deals, which admittedly involved payment, how much would that contribute to upsetting the balance, the harmony, such as it was, that existed in this area?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think a really important question is how much of that, how many of those exchanges really, really occurred, and how much, again, is the sort of the rumor or the fear or the speculation of that happening. So I think it's certainly, I think there's certainly sort of evidence, and I know of instances where there have been, sort of informally selling property, or perhaps less kind of homes, but maybe more, sort of apricot orchards, or, sort of loaning of land, loaning of rice fields, for instance, for those who have them along the Isfara River, which are very profitable. And that is, so I think there is, I think it's important to acknowledge that probably goes on. But I think that there is also, in this sort of hyper sensitized context, where there is a lot of nationalist rhetoric surrounding so-called creeping migration, right? Polish emigracja. There is also a lot of, let's say, kind of discursive amplification of that, which is used to threaten people with not moving. And that is something that I kind of encountered in Aksai, where people, who had, built up lives and in some cases obtained Russian citizenship in Russia, but who still, owned land, or were soon, who were sort of expecting to inherit land, let's say as a youngest son, and to look after, the atajer, the homeland and the home property. I think there has been a lot of pressure on those people to return, to, quote, defend the border. And that's something I think that also politicians have appealed to the local population to remind them that, you are the zashitniki granicy, you're the defenders of the border. And of course, in the last escalation, that creates then extraordinary kind of existential, I think, pressures on those individuals and families who, they're desperate to return to their homes and to their villages and so forth. And yet there is this absolute exhaustion with these repeated conflicts. And I think a kind of, increasing levels of fear that these conflicts won't be resolved, and that this kind of, the threat to one's livelihood, the threat to one's existence, the threat to one's property is always there. And I think, one of my kind of concerns is whether one of the consequences of the latest escalation will be a sort of de facto exodus from border villages, particularly on the Kyrgyzstan side, because of concerns that, demographically, in any, sort of escalation of conflict between Kyrgyz and Tajiks in the area, Tajiks are numerically dominant. And again, that was a very, very significant discourse that I encountered, that quite apart from the demographics of the two nation states, the perception on the Kyrgyzstan side of the border was that, the population of the Tajiks in Varokh and Charku was, equivalent to the entire population of Batken Rayon, right? That was a sort of comparison that people would often make. So I think the demographics of the situation are also significant, both in themselves, but in terms of the threat perception.
Thank you very much. And, I've just seen actually, reports where they're talking to people who were evacuated from the border area, and they made, just as you said, they were questioning whether it was even worth it to go back and build their house again. In some cases, people have had their houses destroyed in last year's fighting and just had their house destroyed again. So there is a lot of questions about whether it's worth it to even try to inhabit that area again. We are at about the halfway point, so it's my time to say that this is the Majlis Podcast, a weekly program from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And this program, we're looking at life along the border, the Kyrgyz-Tajik border, and what it's like for the people who are living there. And I'm very fortunate today to be joined by Madeline Reeves, a professor of social anthropology at Oxford University and author of the book Borderwork, Spatial Lives of the State in Rural Central Asia, which is based upon observations she made when she lived in the area along the Kyrgyz-Tajik border where so much of the fighting has taken place. Thank you for being here again, Madeline. And you know, let's talk a little bit about the changes in life, right? We were there in, I won't say the good old days, but anyway, you know, we were talking before the show started that there was a time when there were no border posts there and there was no military. Even when the IMU was up in the mountains, I remember only once passing one of those train wagons on wheels where they had a guy with a table outside that was just checking to see who was passing through, but there really was no military presence in the area at all. The focus of these governments, and this it's different from Tajik side and from the Kyrgyz side, but their main focus, it seems to me, lately has been the militarization of the border. Now, this works in different ways, of course. The Kyrgyz side, I get the sense, certainly when I was there in 2015, that Kyrgyzstan really wants to build up their presence in this area, whereas the Tajik government's focus is more on security along the border and building up their military force. The Kyrgyz government would prefer that many more people live there for the reasons you said. They're outnumbered, right? But I'm curious about your thoughts about the creeping, or it was creeping. It's certainly increasing in speed now, but the introduction suddenly of the security factor into the region, which is really based upon the mutual threat of the two countries. There is no militant threat in the area right now. There is no Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So there's this militarization process going on that involves preparing to battle your neighboring country. How much does that affect the people of the area, but also their attitudes toward one another? You said they built different roads now, right? So they're not interacting like they used to. The rhetoric coming from their capitals is that they don't come out and say this is an enemy state because they keep trying to say there's reconciliation, but there's the undertone of that this is not, you get the sense that they're not portraying this as a friendly nation anymore. Mm-hmm. What does that do to the relationship along the border?
Yeah, I think I think the short answer is I think it's very detrimental to relations, right? And there's a sort of an irony there, I think, that what we see, and this has been happening, this isn't something kind of recent, this has been, in my book, I kind of track this progressive sort of militarization of the region or the progressive sort of use of an argument that because there are these kind of local conflicts, right, involving stone throwing and disputes over water and so on and land, that because of that, we need a sort of state presence, right? Or we need a military presence. We need a border guard presence to kind of control the border, to regulate these disputes. What I observed quite, regularly was that one of the kind of consequences of this was that disputes that had indeed previously existed, right? This is a region where there have historically been disputes. If you go to the Soviet archive from the 1970s and the late 80s, there are particular sort of moments of escalation. People refer to them as the War of the Spades, right? Vojna Kitmin, and which is kind of indicative in terms of that was the weapon available. So it's not to say that there weren't disputes, but I think one of the consequences of this sort of increasing presence of a security threat is that whenever there were these local disputes that would previously have been resolved by typically elders from the neighboring communities getting together, sitting down over plov and so forth, and figuring out, okay, how are we going to, for instance, make sure that we can regulate water use from the Isfara River in such a way that everybody is able to irrigate their garden plots, for instance. There was a lot of, this kind of very informal diplomacy that was going on. And what happens as soon as you sort of introduce a kind of, not just a state presence, but a state presence in the form of a guy with a Kalashnikov, is that there would be increasing sort of resort to go and call upon the authority of that border guard to come and resolve those local disputes, right? So it took issues that had previously been resolved kind of very locally and informally and based on sort of relations of respect and authority within the local communities, in ways that were linked to age and gender and so forth. They've now sort of been delegated very often to people who are not from the region, who don't know these specificities, who don't, let's say, speak Uzbek, or are able to speak Uzbek to the men from Varokh across the border, who don't have that kind of sensibility of, we've always lived here, we've got to get along, and so forth. So that's one, I think, consequence that, I remember during fieldwork, this was in 2010, this sort of hearing this kind of, sarafanne radio, right? The kind of, the word of mouth kind of going, topalom baştaldı, there's a conflict that's kind of, started. And immediately the response was, we have to ring the head of the local border unit so that he can come and kind of put an end to this, very, very local dispute between neighbors. So this kind of, I think, one of the consequences of this militarization is that, and I'm not here talking about, the most recent events, I'm talking about, a progressive process over the last 10, 15 years, is that there is this recourse to the use of the threat of military force to resolve local disputes. So that's one, I think, really significant consequence. A second significant consequence is that what's been happening is the militarization of this region without any kind of significant progress on the thing that really matters to the local population, which is getting the border delimited, juridically agreed, in certain areas demarcated, but certainly sort of at a juridical level getting absolute clarity on the border. Because only when you have that, then does that risk of so-called creeping migration cease, right? The idea that somehow if you sell your property to somebody from the neighboring state, then de facto the border itself moves. So that's the other thing, is that it's militarization in a sense, in the absence of the political will to really address the kind of the issues of delimitation and demarcation without any aggressive movement on the legal side, on the technical side, or the kind of political will to manifest that. And then I think a third consequence of this militarization is that it means that if the face of the neighboring state that you encounter is a sort of a face that is potentially one that is threatening or coercive, right? It kind of reproduces this sense that, those people are a threat to us, right? If you to be able to get to your local market, you have to kind of, you have to sort of encounter a whole bunch of border guards with Kalashnikovs and so on. It's this kind of intensification of threat within daily life that is, I think, very, very, it can antagonize local relations. And again, I'm basing this on my observations on multiple occasions where I observed, conflicts between a young border guard of one state and an elderly woman from the neighboring state who was, trying to go and get water or trying to go and get firewood from, the kind of the hills roundabout, and where this was sort of, there was a fence taken at the way in which that interaction occurred. I know other instances where women in particular, and younger women in particular, were warned by other members of their community not to take the local minibus, the local marshrutka, because of this sort of presence of border guards. So it has, I think that there was has been a disproportionate impact on women's mobility in a region, as you mentioned before, where kind of gender norms and expectations around sort of appropriate gendered comportment and maintaining of social distance between men and women who are not related is quite pronounced. So there are all of these kinds of consequences, quite apart from the fact that people often perceive and I think there are very legitimate grounds for that perception that those border guards might be corrupt, that they might be not acting in a way that is appropriate, that there's use of bad language and so on and so forth. There's a lot of accusations about border guards from the neighbouring state being drunk, misbehaving, harassing women and so forth. And of course, that can be very, very inflammatory, in a context where there isn't necessarily a sort of strong trust towards state authorities or certainly a strong trust towards state authorities of the neighbouring state.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're going to run out of time here in a few minutes, but there's a couple more points I want to get in here that I really want to address. Now, it has always seemed to me when these conflicts have broken out, whether it was the fistfights and rock throwing or whether it's, the artillery duels that they're having and with helicopter gunships and possibly drones, apparently, that the Kyrgyz side has always seemed much more interested in resolving this problem as fast as possible. Whereas you get the sense that the Tajik side is not, well, they would probably like to see the border marked and put an end to this. They don't seem to be in that much of a hurry. And it occurs to me that, Rahman is not extremely popular in northern Tajikistan. When in the election, the only semi-fair election they had, or close to fair election they had years ago, he ran against a candidate from the north, and it was a very close election nationally. Civil war was on, but and then he went to the north in 1997, 1998. I can't remember the exact year, but there was an assassination attempt against him. So it's pretty clear, and that's my experience too when I've been in Hojan and places in the north too, that Imam Ali Rahman is not very popular, and people don't like him. But then you have this other, we've mentioned Charkuk. Here's a village on the border, which perhaps the poster boy, for lack of a better term, of anti-Rahman sentiment, right? This is a village, I mentioned, I stayed there for a couple nights. It's a Shariat village. To wear the veil. People are very, very religious. They proudly told me, and this was 2006, that 99.9% of the village always votes for the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, which has since then been banned as an extremist group. So how much, in your opinion, it seems this way to me, is it in the interest of the Tajik government that this border conflict continues because it gives them an excuse to keep military forces up there and to keep people who might have anti-government sentiment more concerned about the border conflict than they are about the government in Dushanbe?
I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. I absolutely agree with you that, that's also been my experience, that in a sense, I think Charkuk in particular, Varukh to an extent, but the whole of the Farah Valley, historically in Tajikistan has been viewed by elites in Dushanbe with a certain degree of, I don't know what the best word is, fear, but also perhaps a sense that, this region is not kind of adhering to the vision of sort of authoritarian secularism that is being promoted by Rahman, right? So I absolutely agree that, this is also very, it's important to recognize that this is a very distinctive region within the context of Tajikistan. Whether it's a question of sort of deliberately, wanting to keep this as an area of trouble and threat as a way to sort of bring this region then under the orbit of the central Tajik authorities, I don't know. I think that would be a really interesting question to pose to somebody who is more of a Tajikistan expert than me. But what I would say is that the perception in Tajikistan that, and this was something that I encountered on multiple occasions talking to people on the Tajik side of the border in the mid-2000s, the perception on the Tajikistan side of the border was, if only our government responded to local demands and local grievances in a way that the Kyrgyz authorities respond to local demands and local grievances in Batken. If only there was this level of sort of responsiveness and kind of, I don't know, even sort of political interest, let alone kind of, investment in border infrastructure, then, we would live so much better. That was something that I often encountered on the Tajik side, was a feeling that there was a comparative lack of political voice that wasn't just to do with the different political systems in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, but that was to do with the fact that the Kyrgyzstani authorities devoted a lot of attention to, the Chegara Masilesi, the border issue, that it sort of had a salience in public discourse. And there was a feeling that I encountered at that time on the Tajik side of the border of being kind of largely ignored by the Dushanbe authorities. So I guess a short kind of comment in response to yours is to say I'm not sure whether it was the sort of, deliberately kind of keeping this as a region that, needs to be kept under control, or whether it was just sort of ignoring it really, and a lack of kind of political will or political capacity to address people's, really significant grievances and concerns, to do with, for instance, shortages of land, shortages of water, lack of job opportunities, and it's worth mentioning that, for instance, one of the main industries locally on the Tajik side of the border in Shorab, which had been a huge sort of mining town, had gone down to sort of one mine working, so there's also sort of real issues around opportunities for work in a context where land is in extremely short supply.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. We got to get down to the very last question. Again, getting back to where we started from, the way this border is drawn, and you made the point in your book too, for instance, we talked about the road, but we haven't talked about the water canals, right? That were dug during Soviet times that were, of course, internal, right? This is one country in the Soviet days. Now they go back and forth through, into Tajikistan, back into Kyrgyzstan stuff. Is it really possible to divide the border? Or are they going to have to come up with something more, in your opinion? Are they going to have to come up with something more creative? Because you can't, when people talk about dividing the border, you think of a line or a wall or a fence. And having been through that area, I don't see how it's possible to do that. There are always going to be areas where people aren't going to be sure whose country this belongs to, or that they have to cooperate in the case of the roads or water canals, because it serves both their purposes, that these arteries are kept open. So how is it, in your opinion, is it possible to actually divide the border, or do we have to come to some kind of mutual understanding about sharing the resources along the border as a better option?
So I think it's important to kind of not conflate two things. I think it's really important to juridically delimit the border, right? And to have that sort of intergovernmental agreement about where the juridical line of the border is. Because until that point exists, there are constantly going to be the kinds of claims and counterclaims that we've seen. If you look at the statements of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan over the last week, kind of claim and counterclaim about territory and about, where the quotes real border lies. But I think that is a very separate question from what does the form and the shape of that border look like as a material entity on the ground. And there are a multitude of kind of global examples where a border doesn't have to mean, the existence of an international border doesn't have to mean, barbed wire and razor wire. I think this is where it comes to a question of sort of political will and political diplomacy, let's say. And you mentioned the word creative solutions, and thinking, let's say, from other global examples of places where states have resolved complex transboundary issues. And I'll just throw out one. India and Bangladesh have managed to resolve an area where there are huge numbers of enclaves, right? A significant part of an incredibly complex border, again, post-colonial borders. There are ways that this can be done sort of at a technical level. What matters is the political will, and what matters is for people on both sides of that border to feel secure, right? Secure that they can go to the market unharmed, that their house won't be burned down, that their kids can go to school safely. I mean, at a very, very basic existential questions. And I think part of the problem, actually, in terms of the kind of political imagination on both sides of the border, is that there is this assumption that, the only way to resolve the border here is to put up, is to sort of have a wall or a fence. Actually, there are ways that one can have a functioning border regime which nonetheless allows people to peaceably go about their lives, right? There are examples of that, in the European Union, but there are also a whole host of other global examples of what that might look like. And I think part of when I talk about sort of political imagination and political will is drawing upon some of those examples to say, okay, what would it look like to have a border that were juridically delimited, but where people could still easily cross back and forth? What would that mean in terms of permits? What would that mean in terms of how and where the border is policed? What would that mean in terms of, special designations for particular communities? What would that mean in terms of infrastructure and so on and so forth? These are questions that, if there's the political will, I think can be resolved.
Great. Let's leave it on this potentially optimistic note then. And thank you to Madeline Reeves, who's a professor of social anthropology at Oxford University and the author of the book Border Work, Spatial Lives of the State in Rural Central Asia, which is about life along the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. Appreciate you being here today, Madeline. I also want to give a big thank you to my producer in Washington, D.C., Nathan Shoemaker. I'm, of course, Bruce Pannier, the host of the Majlis Podcast, and a reminder that you can subscribe to the Majlis Podcast or the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.